Washington, July 13th, 1945. My darling Barbara, unless there's an unforeseen foul-up now, this will be my last letter for a few days. That damn trip is finally coming up. Bud has been made project supervisor for the procurement program. He's on his way over with Parrish and another cutter. We'll hit about 10 major cities and cover all Bavaria and southern Germany. We may even sneak into the French and British zones. Sometimes I think the job is a few sizes too big for me. I suppose I've never before had so much responsibility. There's so much to do, and so much of it is so important that I grow terrified.
The war is coming to an end. The world is entering a new era to the rhythm of discussions between the victors. The question of the punishment to be imposed on the Nazi war criminals is a subject of several meetings at the highest level, at the end of which it is decided to organize a big trial in Germany in the town of Nuremberg. The modalities of this unprecedented trial, which will be a milestone in history, are discussed in London from June 1945. At the same time, almost 4,000 miles away in the United States, two young soldiers, two brothers, are preparing to experience an adventure that will mark them for life. The youngest, Stuart Schulberg, who writes nearly every day to his wife, is only 23 years old. His brother, a Navy lieutenant, Bud Schulberg, is 31. Young and idealistic, they are made in the image of this new world, born out of the rubble of World War II. Both have accepted a special mission to track down and compile the archives of Nazi crimes, films, and photos, which will serve as evidence against 24 dignitaries of the regime who are due to be judged mid-September at the Nuremberg trials. It's the great film director John Ford himself who has entrusted them with this mission. At the time, Ford is heading the Field Photographic Branch, a special unit of the OSS, the American intelligence agency responsible for all visual documentation of the war. The majority of its troops were recruited among Hollywood's filmmakers and technicians, where the Schulberg name was famous. Stuart and Bud's father was one of the bosses at Paramount. It's the beginning of summer 1945. That gives them 3 months. 3 months to compile visual evidence of the greatest crime of all time and to build the foundation of our collective memory of this historic period. Even though the documents compiled by the Schulbergs and presented at the Nuremberg trials are famous today, there exists little trace of the mission itself. Some letters sent by Stuart to his young wife Barbara, some photos kept by his daughter Sandra Schulberg, who has become the guardian of this little-known story. During our research, we have discovered these images, the only ones that exist of the Schulberg mission. At the center, Stuart, the youngest of the two brothers. Sandra is seeing them for the first time.
This is an extraordinary find. I've only seen photographs of my father when he was a young man. I've never seen motion pictures of my father. Oh, it's so incredible to see this. I get emotional when I think about how young Stuart was. He was the youngest member of the OSS film team. How shocking it must have been to be seeing these atrocity images over and over again, they had to manipulate this material. They had to watch it, hundreds of times. And yet, I'm also struck by their innocence, their belief that they were doing something very important.
Today, other elements enable us to partially reconstruct this mission. In particular, this lecture given towards the end of his life by Bud Schulberg, who after the war became one of the greatest screenwriters in Hollywood. He relives the key moments of this exceptional dive into the heart of this major historical moment.
I had no idea what I was getting into. And we first started getting all the Fox Movietone newsreels, which actually were German films with our American narrations. I mean, we ran that in New York City day and night, day and night.
To lull the fears of the little neutrals, propaganda minister...
After 2 intensive weeks at the Fox Movietone's headquarters, the main American image bank, the two brothers select around 30 hours of footage, fully analyzed and indexed. This first selection features images of the first book burnings, as well as Goering's speeches, who was then Minister of the Interior, which are at the origin of the first anti-Semitic riots.
Zwischen Juden und staatsangehörigen Deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
First trial was set for September 15, and General Bill Donovan, who was the head of OSS, Donovan said, "Would you?" He dropped a bombshell on us and said, "By the way, none of that what you did in New York on the Fox Movietone will be acceptable. They're being very strict about this. They don't want to say the film came from the United States, and the defense counsel will knock it out. They could say we tampered with the film." So it was almost like starting all over again.
Since it was impossible to use the images obtained in the United States, the two brothers had no choice but to go to Germany in search of the original material used in these TV reports. The country is in ruins. Nuremberg, the city symbolic of Nazi triumphalism, is a ghost town. The Palace of Justice, even though partially damaged, is still standing. The American teams get busy there to ensure everything will be ready on time. Justice Robert Jackson has taken command of operations. A member of the Supreme Court of the United States, he is a visionary who intends to make the trial the inaugural act of international justice that has yet to be constructed. For the first time, a court will pass judgment on crimes committed by a sovereign state. And for the first time, a new aid makes its debut in court, a cinema screen.
En général, dans un prétoire anglo-saxon, les juges sont placés en fond de salle, à la croisée des regards et face au public. Et pour installer l'écran de cinéma, l'OSS a eu l'idée de déloger les juges pour installer l'écran et donc le placer au point focal de la salle, ce qui nécessitait donc de déplacer les juges sur la droite à la place laissée vide, vacante par le jury, puisqu'il n'y avait pas de jury au procès militaire international de Nuremberg.
July 16th, 1945. Darling, I'm now in Germany. It's odd to be here, crazy to walk down the once Nazi streets, thinking humdrum American thoughts. Only the children are really unchanged. They race around the streets, clamber in and out of the bomb ruins, beg for chocolate. We're beginning to see more and more German soldiers now walking home in their stained Wehrmacht uniforms and their army packs still on their backs. They look exhausted and dirty, and they walk stooped over and avoid our eyes. The people hate us, there's no question of that. I don't think we will have much luck in converting these people to democratic thinking. To them, our attempts at education are American propaganda.
The Schulbergs are now in a requisitioned villa in the suburbs of Berlin, where they set up their editing suite. One of their first assignments concerns the film Triumph of the Will, a monument of Nazi propaganda filmed during the 1934 Nuremberg rally. An American copy of the film was already known to the intelligence agencies. After a first analysis of the German copy, orders were given to Bud Schulberg to find and arrest the film's director, Leni Riefenstahl, one of the members of Hitler's inner circle.
The party rallies included two valuable things. One was what they actually said at those rallies, and also there were people whose very presence indicted them. People who said that they were just German officials, but not necessarily Nazi party related, and showing them with their Nazi badges and things. And Riefenstahl was helpful in identifying various people.
Zu verstehen und zu begreifen, was Sie, mein Führer, für Deutschland bedeuten.
Among the Nazi dignitaries identified with Leni Riefenstahl's help is notably Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's former finance minister.
Nur ein Teil eines Volkes aus wirklich aktiven Kämpfern bestehen.
Despite having sworn to the American investigators that he wasn't compromised by Nazism, the images of his presence among the officials prove the contrary. Leni Riefenstahl also identifies Hans Frank, the former Nazi governor of Poland, in favor of exterminating all the Jews in the country, who will also be sitting in the dock with the defendants some weeks later in Nuremberg.
The strategy of the prosecutors was to convict the defendants using their own words and their own recording of their criminal deeds. They had access to film that Leni Riefenstahl and others had shot. So once again, it came from the German government itself. And no one could claim that it was illegitimately edited, misleadingly edited. This was the Germans' own presentation of what they were doing. The written word was absolutely inadequate to describing what had happened. An ordinary criminal situation, you know, you're walking down the street and someone puts a gun to your chest and demands your money. We can all imagine that. But you couldn't imagine what happened in the Nazi reign of terror. And the only compelling way to do that, I think, really was through film.
Among the countless reels of horrific scenes found and viewed by the Schulbergs team were these images, shot by the Germans themselves in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. It was only in the 1990s that new research has enabled us to understand that it was a Nazi propaganda film intended to illustrate the so-called inferiority of the Jews. However, in 1945, when the Schulbergs discover these images, the shock is severe because the victims are very real.
Someone asked me what was almost like the most horrifying moment of all the horrifying moments. And I said, I think it may be in that German film on Warsaw. They show the dishes where the poor emaciated the bodies are being buried. And they have a cameraman, a German cameraman, right down deep in the pit, shooting up as these emaciated, naked bodies are being thrown past them. They're actually doing them. This is not exposing from the other side. This is them photographing what they were doing, including the most unbelievable. I mean, women with infants were being thrown down past the camera, and the thought of that guy down there just doing this as his job was something that is hard to ever erase from your mind.
At the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, preparations are moving quickly. The date for the opening of the trials, scheduled for mid-September 1945, is fast approaching. To support the accusations, Justice Jackson's team is keeping the pressure on the Schulberg mission.
We were very, very worried about time, but we had no time. So I went down to Nuremberg to talk with the Jackson legal staff to get the particulars of the indictments and find out specifically how the photographic evidence would dovetail with their actual indictments. From that point on, we worked very closely. They were building a case that Nazis had conspired almost from the beginning, from 1933 on. So they had these many different steps of the indictment, crimes against humanity and crimes against the existing peace of the world. So I would go away with that information and then look for film.
This short film about the Schulberg mission, shot at the time, features this sequence that recounts the work of searching for images of Nazi crimes. This reconstruction is a realistic portrayal, and the situations seem barely credible. Yet, this scene really happened. Some films have been found in this type of circumstance, abandoned during the rout of the German army. While the prosecution case is far from being complete, certain tensions appear in the American team, who are divided on Jackson's strategy of staking everything on the Nazi documents to the detriment of witness hearings. These rivalries, added to the time constraints, further complicate the task for the Schulbergs.
I took the first shipment to London yesterday, SS Secret Film. I think I'll be in the field soon, getting some more. If only we could get squared away on administrative details. Every moment we lose now means we'll find that much less when we get into the field. A little depressed tonight because the job is getting so snafu. I wouldn't care except that the job is so damned important, and so many big people are counting on us and expecting us to do our part. And unless something happens, and quickly, we're going to foul up the biggest assignment Field Photo ever got.
While the Schulbergs seriously doubt the success of their mission, a decisive new capture gives them hope. This capture is Heinrich Hoffmann. He is Hitler's personal photographer. The Schulbergs and their editing team, here Joe Sigman, spotted him on one of the seized films. He is quickly arrested, along with the other film technicians from the propaganda department headed by Goebbels. As a result of this, Stuart Schulberg manages to seize the entire stock of photos of Heinrich Hoffmann, 12,000 negatives, which were immediately sent to London to be analyzed for the trial. In an attempt to prove their good faith, the prisoners provide valuable information to the American soldiers.
We learned from them that the SS had its own film unit, and that they made what they call reports. We would call it atrocities, but it was work that they were very proud of. Killing all these Jews and doing all this was sort of all, from their point of view, purifying, cleansing Germany, and eventually all of Europe. They told me that these films, they were often two real films, and would be shown at the homes of the Nazi leaders, Goebbels and Hitler and the rest of them, and they called them desserts because they showed them as a sort of entertainment after dinner. We thought we were going to find some of this film.
Thanks to the tip-off from another informer, Bud Schulberg learns of the existence of a secret cache where the Nazis might have stocked some of their most compromising films. According to this information, the cache is at the bottom of a salt mine, nearly 2,000 feet deep. This mine still exists today. It is situated at Grasleben in the Magdeburg region.
We went through a long tunnel, and at the end of the tunnel was an incredible, unbelievable sight. There were acres, like football fields and fields of film burning. Tons and tons of film, all burned, burning, destroyed. We lost them. We lost, can't tell you what, in a way, history and what we lost in the destruction of that.
Learning of the existence of another secret cache at Rudersdorf near Berlin, Bud hurries there in the hope of seizing the films intact. But he's too late. Again, the site has just been set alight.
At the very least, it's a remarkable coincidence that we have all these film fires in such a short period of time. It is likely that there was a systematic policy to destroy incriminating film. But it's quite comparable to what they did with other evidence of crimes. I mean, Aktion 1005, the attempt to disinter all the bodies of the people they had shot, especially on the Eastern Front, and to burn all of those bodies as an attempt to hide evidence. I would say that this absolutely is also the case with film.
The Schulbergs are engaged in a real race against the clock. It's imperative that they find other archive stocks before the Nazis manage to destroy them. It's already November 1945, and room 600 of the Palace of Justice is now fully ready. Journalists from all over the world start to converge on Nuremberg. While the pressure is maximum on the Schulbergs and their team, the opening of the trials is postponed for logistical reasons. The new date is set for November 20th, 1945. The Schulbergs make the most of these extra days by attempting one last mission. They've just learned of the existence of another important cache, but this time in the Soviet sector, which hugely complicates things. Because even though the premise of the Cold War hasn't totally cut all ties, the relationship between the Soviets and Americans is very tense. Bud, the eldest, takes the initiative and on the off chance, contacts the officer of the Red Army responsible for the Babelsberg sector where the secret cache might be found. Against all expectations, he agrees to meet him.
Major Avenarius, I never forget him. And he said, I don't understand this. Why is a young naval officer coming here into the Soviet-controlled part of Germany? I just don't understand what you're doing. So I said, well, it's a long story, Major, but we're part of the Commander John Ford's. I got about that far, and he said, John Ford? In one word, he said, John Ford? He said, you know John Ford? And I said, God, we work, he's our boss. Well, he says, I have written 2 books about John Ford. It turns out that this man is the biggest expert on John Ford in the world. He wants to know movie by movie by movie, every single one. He got so excited. He said, remember that shot in Young Abe Lincoln when Henry Ford has his foot up on the desk and the shooting? You remember the angle? I tell you.
And for that,
it was extraordinary.
$250 damages.
Yes, I do.
Now he's our friend. He do it. really do anything for us. He said, come, he's got all the negatives. He's got the negatives of films that we've been looking for. And he actually said, like, bring a truck. You can take anything you want.
Certainly there were some efforts by German lackeys to destroy evidence. It's not clear what was destroyed. That's why the swap, as apparently took place between the Russian head of the Babelsberg studio and the Schulbergs of original Nazi material that was all stored in Babelsberg, is so interesting because that he had the keys to the kingdom.
This list, drawn up by Bud Schulberg for the attention of his superiors, features a number of documents that his new friend, Major Avenarius, had agreed to hand over. Among them, a damning speech given by the regime's ideologue, Alfred Rosenberg, which will be a key factor in his conviction by the court in Nuremberg. Other images will be invaluable in detailing the policy of terror inflicted by the Nazis during their conquest of power, crucially supporting the accusation of conspiracy and premeditation against the defendants on trial in Nuremberg. They have now been transferred to the basement of the Palace of Justice, where they await the imminent opening of the trial. One of the defendants, Robert Ley, committed suicide a few days earlier, and the defendants are now watched 24 hours a day.
Yesterday, we experienced another great moment. Rudolf Hess, one of the defendants, was taken to our screening room to watch images of himself and other high-ranking members of the Nazi regime screaming and yelling their propaganda. Hess is pretending to have amnesia in the hope of evading justice. With us was a team of psychiatrists who've been observing Hess since his arrival here. They were all hoping to catch him out, watching for a sign, anything, that would allow them to prove that he's simulating. Well, if he's simulating, it's working. He's done remarkably well, managing to succeed in making his amnesia totally credible.
Attention, the International Military Tribunal will now enter.
November 20th, 1945, a date that will go down in history, the opening of the Nuremberg trials. 218 hearing days, 5,330 documents, 236 witnesses, debates in 4 languages simultaneously translated. Seated in the dock out of the 24 defendants, 21 were high-ranking Nazi officials. 3 are missing. 1 committed suicide, another is on the run, and the 3rd is exempt for medical reasons. From now on, Justice Jackson knows that he can count on the films prepared by the Schulbergs to create a sensation in the trials. Several montages have been prepared from the archives compiled by the 2 brothers, but also from images shot during the liberation of camps by American, British, and Soviet cameramen. These films will be screened throughout the hearings to support the various charges.
Europe, generation after generation. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility.
These defendants arrange frequently to be photographed in action.
We will show you their own films. You will see their own conduct and hear their own voices as these defendants reenact for you some of the events in the course of the conspiracy. The real complaining party at your bar is civilization.
Jackson explique qu'il va précisément montrer les films nazis, parce que les dignitaires, les accusés avaient finalement la vanité de se faire souvent filmer, en expliquant de manière assez précise que le tribunal va pouvoir entendre les paroles des accusés et les voir rejouer sur l'écran certains épisodes du complot, du plan concerté. Donc on pourrait presque dire que le procureur Jackson imagine un peu les films comme une sorte de reconstitution judiciaire par écran interposé.
Justice Jackson insisted that the trials be filmed. What he has in mind is a great movie, Universal, which, while recounting the main steps of a trial he wants to be exemplary, would act on future generations as a real antidote against fascism and arbitrariness. Understandably, Jackson first turned to Bud Schulberg to direct it. But Bud, impatient to get back to his personal writing projects, intends to return to New York. So it will be his younger brother, Stuart, who will get on with the job to make the first great trial film, which will become the template of all those which will succeed it in history. It won't be an easy task. At the time, cameras and sound recorders are bulky and noisy pieces of equipment. And several judges think that their presence could jeopardize the serenity of the proceedings. Therefore, the equipment will most of the time be isolated behind glass panels in locations specifically converted for the occasion.
Il y en a essentiellement trois. Celui de la cage de verre, qui se situe à la gauche des juges et qui permet d'enregistrer du son de manière synchrone avec l'image. Une autre caméra se situera à l'opposé, à la droite des juges et permettra de filmer à la fois les accusés mais aussi l'intervention des procureurs. Enfin, une troisième caméra se situera dans le box à l'origine des opérateurs radio et qui permettra là encore de produire images et sons.
Bei der Besichtigung der Gaskammern, und zwar in Funktion.
400 journalists from all over the world are present in the room. But confronted by the tedious aspects of some debates, slowed down by simultaneous translations, the interest of the press seems to gradually wane. Justice Jackson therefore decides to bring the date initially planned for the screening of the first movie of the Nazi atrocities forward by a couple of days. Stuart Schulberg carries out the last lighting checks. For Jackson, it is important to be able to capture on celluloid the reaction of the defendants watching the images of their crimes.
By the time of the final tests, we realized that the light source was too bright, and therefore it was hard to see the images on the screen. Consequently, we decided at the last minute to dim the neon tubes that we'd positioned by the defendant's feet with adhesive tape. It was then past 9 o'clock. While I was crouching, busily working on my neon tube, Goering and Hess came towards me. I was right in their trajectory to the dock. As I was level with his leather boots, Goering briefly looked at my setup and said, "Cinema, is it?" As for Hess, who at the time was still faking amnesia, he started clapping his hands, looking amazed. Goering smiled and turned towards me, shrugging his shoulders. Half an hour later, as the images were displayed on the Nuremberg screen, their smiles disappeared.
If the tribunal please, we shall proceed with the projection of the film.
The first film prepared by the Schulberg's team is shown on November 29, 1945. It is an hour-long montage made from footage filmed by the Allied forces during the liberation of the concentration camps.
These are the locations of the largest concentration and prison camps maintained throughout Germany and occupied Europe under the Nazi regime. This film report, covering a representative group of such camps, illustrates the general conditions which prevail.
The camp is chosen for a high command inspection led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Also present are Generals Omar N. Bradley and George S. Patton. The 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army liberated this camp early in April. They see the woodshed where lime-covered bodies are stacked in layers, and the stench is overpowering. The general and his party next see the crude woodland crematory, actually a grill made of railway tracks. Charred remains of several inmates still lay heaped atop the grill.
J'avais 21 ans, 22 ans. C'était évidemment assez impressionnant. Les visions d'horreur, ça a été tout au début du procès, et ça a créé évidemment une émotion considérable, même parmi les accusés qui ne pouvaient plus dire que ça n'a pas existé. Enfin, ces visions de cadavres traînés par des bulldozers, etc., c'était abominable.
Ça a créé un vrai choc dans...
Ça a créé un vrai choc, et en particulier, même les accusés, bon, même s'ils disaient on ne savait pas, ils étaient quand même face à ces horreurs. Et c'était un bon coup de la part de Jackson de montrer ces horribles images assez tôt pendant le procès.
This was Bergen-Belsen.
When the lights came back on, like everyone in the room, I was staring at the 21 defendants. Keitel was wiping away tears. Ribbentrop, the sophisticated diplomat with an answer for everything, was staring at his feet while slowly nodding his head. Raeder and Dönitz, the 2 high-ranking officers, were staring straight ahead into space. Rosenberg had his head on the table in front of him. And even Goering, who until then had been sniggering and winking and grinning at his colleagues, seemed stunned, his mouth agape. But the most astonishing reaction was that of Hans Frank, prosecuted for the murder of 5 million Polish people. While all the defendants were leaving one by one towards their cells, he remained motionless, seated, until a guard came to literally drag him to his cell.
He is really moved, I have to admit, nearly crying. Yeah. He should have kept this crying and admitting what he has done.
Do you think they never saw this footage before? Because
I can't say it for all the other defendants, but I would say it nearly. I'm 100% sure that my father never had seen this before because he didn't want to see it. He knew exactly what was going on, what was happening to all these innocent people, but to see it personally, like here in this room, that was really new for him.
You don't think he had any remorse?
No, he had not. On the last evening of his life, he wrote to Mr. Seidel, his lawyer, and to his wife, our mother, saying, please find out the truth about me. I never was a criminal. Unbelievable. After you have had a year of proofs, you have seen movies about Auschwitz, yes? Everything And then he is saying something like this for me, and therefore I never will forgive him, never.
The day after the screening, the first twist in the tale. Rudolf Hess, who until then was hiding behind the persona of an amnesiac, suddenly asks for authorization to read a statement.
Herr Präsident, ab nunmehr steht mein Gedächtnis auch nach außen hin wieder zur Verfügung. Die Gründe für das Vortäuschen von Gedächtnisverlust sind taktischer Art. Ich betone, dass ich die volle Verantwortung trage für alles, was ich getan, unterschrieben oder mit unterschrieben habe.
A few days later, on December 11, 1945, the prosecution shows the court the second film prepared by the Schulberg's team. They'd barely finished editing it. Lasting 3 hours and 15 minutes, the Nazi plan was edited from the documents found during the two brothers' mission. This film is crucial in supporting the idea that the war and the atrocities committed by the Nazis were premeditated. More than any other film, the Nazi plan has shaped our collective memory of that period.
Both Schulbergs, I would say, were very much responsible for shaping our image. Even today, most documentaries made about the so-called Third Reich go back to footage that was systemized and gathered for that film. Everyone's going to that source and uses it. So, I mean, the work of both of the Schulbergs for their project at that time cannot be overestimated in their long-time effect.
Drawing on the Nazi plan's meticulously reconstructed chronology, the debates continue. Weeks, months of questioning, cross-examining. The Americans want to show the world that despite the enormity of the crime, justice must be impartial. This is what is at stake with the film of the trials entrusted to the youngest of the Schulberg brothers. But to accomplish this new mission, he's going to have to face a series of obstacles.
For a trial that will last almost a year, the decision was issued by the judges, by the tribunal, that the filmmakers must only film during 35 hours. Actually, we have something like 38, 39 hours. That is due to the fact that certain situations were filmed with several cameras from several angles. And that was the material Stuart Schulberg has to work with. The camera teams inside this courtroom were US Army camera teams. They were not from the OSS as originally planned because the OSS was closed down. So the US Army Signal Corps, they took over. They are a unit to provide telecommunication and other communication, and their camera teams were not able to speak German. So another big problem. They were filming, sometimes they were catching some very important scenes, sometimes not, sometimes they were stopping too early. So the problem was the film material that survived and that Stuart Schulberg could pick out of was not very good.
But Stuart Schulberg finds a solution. The entirety of the debates, having been recorded on wax discs, he undertakes with the help of two of his editors, Robert Parrish and Joe Zigman, a colossal task. That is to make the most of the little footage he has available by playing in some offs. That means turning up the volume on the listening shots.
Ich möchte nochmals betonen, dass ich über militärische Maßnahmen nichts wusste. Und wenn ich es gewusst hätte, hätte ich nicht die geringste Veranlassung etwa hier.
But while Stuart Schulberg is struggling in the editing suite, the Soviets, who also intend to include the trial in their national narrative, are undertaking their own project entrusted to cameraman and director Roman Karman. The Nuremberg courtroom becomes the place where the two allies are positioning themselves at the forefront of history, each trying to appear as the great victor of Nazism. In this fight for control of the historical narrative, images will play a vital part. The Soviets managed to obtain a special day of filming outside the trial, where they can shoot the defendants settling down in the dock, as per an ordinary day at court. The Soviet director, Roman Karman, has found a prime location, which provides him with a full series of close-up shots that the Americans have never been able to shoot. These close-ups, filmed by Roman Karman, are an extremely effective dramaturgy. Even today, it allows us to appreciate the full intensity of what is happening in the room. As on October 1st, 1946, the day of the verdict delivered by the president of the trial, Judge Lawrence.
On the defendants, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
12 death penalties,
Rudolf Hess,
3 life sentences, 4 others of between 10 and 20 years, 3 acquittals. 11 out of the 12 condemned were executed 2 weeks later in the Nuremberg prison courtyard.
sentences you to death by hanging.
The last, Goering, killed himself in his cell the day before his execution. It will take nearly a year and a half for Stuart Schulberg to complete his film dedicated to the trial. Differences within the American authorities regarding the purpose of the film considerably delayed his work. He will have to write 11 successive versions of the script before he can tackle the editing of the film itself. Several months have passed since the end of the trial. While he is in the middle of editing his film, the young director manages to get his hands on an exceptional film document. It's given to him by a Berlin resident who has just purchased the house of a former high-ranking Nazi official, Arthur Nebbe. It shows one of the first attempts of the gassing of human beings, very likely filmed by Arthur Nebbe himself in 1941. The victims are patients of a psychiatric asylum in the Mogilev region in Belarus. Stuart Schulberg writes at the time that it is the only known document that shows the crime being committed. These images were still undiscovered during the Nuremberg trials, but they were of such importance that Stuart decides to include them in his edit. It's now the beginning of 1947. While Stuart Schulberg is far from having finished his film, the film directed by Roman Karman, The Nuremberg Trials, is ready. The Soviets even go as far as having a premiere in the heart of New York on Times Square. Reds beat Yanks. The American press is sarcastic about the delay in the making of the American film. A delay blamed on the rivalries between Washington and the American military authorities in Berlin.
One of the big battles that took place was whether the film should be made just for a German audience or whether it should be made for an international audience. The people in Berlin with military government really felt that it should be, its primary use should be as a denazification, re-education tool. They wanted to show the difference between Nazi justice and Allied justice. Stuart Schulberg really felt, if you look through the documents, that they were making a film that was not just for Germany. They felt that the Nuremberg trial was a milestone in the history of civilization and that the whole world needed to learn the lessons of Nuremberg, not just the German public.
Navigating as best as he can between these contradictory injunctions, Stuart Schulberg finally finishes his film in early 1948, 1 year after Roman Karman's.
Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, Great Britain. Mr. Francis Biddle, United States. Monsieur Henri de Vabre, France. Major General Yona Nikitchenko, USSR, and their alternates prepared
Lasting 80 minutes, Stuart Schulberg's film recounts all the stages of the Nuremberg trial, made at the time when the Soviets, Americans, French, and British were still united against Nazism. Entitled Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, it's a strong film, necessary, where the great moments of the trial and also all the filmed archives that Stuart and Bud Schulberg compiled for Justice Jackson make history.
SS Chief Himmler ordered the complete liquidation of the ghetto with the use of utmost force.
The film also includes the main footage taken during the liberation of the camps by the American, British, and Soviet operators. But the world will not see this film. At least, not for many years. On June 28, 1948, Soviet forces suddenly surround Berlin, blockading the German capital, which is only receiving supplies thanks to the Berlin airlift put in place by the Western forces. The world is falling into the Cold War.
The same Cold War that brought, for the most part, an end to post-war Allied enthusiasm for prosecuting Nazi war criminals, that caused the trials basically to peter out by 1950. That same Cold War, in which now, of course, Germany was, or at least Western Germany was our ally, and our former ally, the Soviet Union, was now our enemy. Not at all the story portrayed in the film. The film conflicted with that narrative. And so a great opportunity was lost to educate Americans and to remind them of what we fought for.
A premiere of Stuart Schulberg's film is nevertheless organized in Germany in November 1948. Not in Berlin, still surrounded by the Soviets, but in Stuttgart. Given the success of the first screenings, the American release is scheduled for the following weeks.
The United States is the only...
But in Washington, the climate has changed. Congress has just approved the launch of a vast reconstruction plan for Europe. 2 years have passed since the end of the Nuremberg trials. The implementation of the Marshall Plan is now the main priority of the American government.
During the Marshall Plan, millions and millions of dollars were invested in not only in Germany and the whole of Europe, but also in Germany to help them recover their economy, to bring them forth. And this, of course, collides with the idea of punishing war criminals. Bulldozers, pushing the dead bodies in mass graves, that would clearly harm the idea of helping these people.
At the end of 1948, a decision is made. The release of the film is purely and simply canceled. The humanist ambitions of Justice Jackson, of Stuart Schulberg, and all his team who had put so much hope and energy into this film are being destroyed by the new political situation in Washington. But the imperatives of the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe might not be the only reasons.
It wasn't just an accident that this film was not released in American theaters. It was a government decision. And that decision was made by our Secretary of the Army at the time, Kenneth Royal. There were a number of high-ranking American officers who did not feel that prosecuting high-ranking German military leaders at Nuremberg was appropriate. They felt that they were the ones taking orders from Adolf Hitler, and they did not consider themselves responsible for the Nazi crime. So there was some degree of solidarity amongst German military officers and American military officers. As I was growing up, I really knew nothing about my father's Nuremberg film. My mother died in 2002, and when we were clearing out her apartment, we found all these boxes of material about Nuremberg that we really never knew existed. And we found a 16mm print of the film, which had been sitting there on the corner shelf for years and years with people putting their wine glasses on it. I mean, we never really realized it was sitting there. And finding these documents, suddenly it all began to be there, present, asking questions, what happened? So I began to try to make sense of the papers, and they're still, I'm afraid, all around me because I'm still working with them and trying to understand the whole story.
For nearly 10 years, Sandra Schulberg has undertaken a colossal task to restore her father's film. It required finding the original movie reels, restoring the images which had degraded over time, as well as the audio, a part of which had been lost. Today, the film exists in 13 languages, and Sandra is traveling the world to show it anew. Thanks to her, her father's work can finally find its way in the world, and its title, Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, can have real significance.
As I was re-watching Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, what's amazing is to see how prescient Jackson was. I mean, tragically prescient, really. He says, what makes this inquest significant is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatred, terrorism, and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism and intrigue and war-making. The very same problems that we deal with today. The world has not changed as much as the dreamers who brought us the Nuremberg trial thought it would. And that's why I think they made this film. They wanted to be sure that the world didn't forget and that the world would learn these lessons. Unfortunately, we still have a lot to learn.